The safety recall detailed in this program involves 1989 and 1990 model year Jeep Cherokee and Wagoneer models equipped with the anti-lock brake system. On these vehicles, the anti-lock brake, or ABS system, may become impaired through two contamination conditions. The boost pump inlet filter could become restricted due to a formation of a precipitate in the brake fluid, and the brake master cylinder boost valve snap ring may break due to stress corrosion. In addition to these ABS conditions, the front brake hose may rub against the front tire due to improper hose routing. To correct these conditions, the ABS system low-pressure hose must be replaced. The ABS actuator assembly must be rebuilt, and the front brake hose must be inspected for proper routing and repositioned if necessary. For repair of affected vehicles, a partial distribution of ABS service parts packages, part number C3940409, is being shipped and billed to all involved dealers. In addition, actuator housing parts packages, part number C3940410, must be ordered from parts depots at dealer cost as needed. To begin the service procedure, you must first remove the hydraulic unit. During this procedure, some non-related components have been removed or disconnected for better visual access. First, the brake system pressure must be pumped down. To do this, turn the ignition switch to the off position and pump the brake pedal 45 to 50 times until the pedal becomes firm. It's important to note that the ABS boost system pressure is 1,650 to 2,050 psi. Failure to properly reduce system pressure could result in serious personal injury. Also, to protect yourself, remember to wear safety goggles when disconnecting any fluid lines during this procedure. After reducing system pressure, disconnect the high pressure line at the accumulator block and place the end of the line in a container. Then turn the ignition to the on position to drain the brake fluid reservoir. Be careful around the accumulator tank and the small accumulator on the booster pump. They contain high-pressure gas charges. Do not puncture or attempt to disassemble either of these components at any time. After draining, cap the line and the fitting to prevent dirt entry or other contamination of the system. Throughout this procedure, be very careful to prevent brake fluid from contacting any painted surfaces. If contact occurs, flush the area thoroughly with water. Next, turn the ignition switch to the off position and disconnect the negative battery terminal. Now remove the windshield washer fluid reservoir attaching screws, disconnect the reservoir hoses and wires, and remove the reservoir. Next, disconnect the electrical connector at the proportioning valve differential switch. Disconnect the connector at the low pressure switch. And disconnect the electrical connectors from the modulator boost pressure switch and the fluid level switch. Next, remove the boost pressure switch from the modulator. Then disconnect the front and rear brake lines at the outboard side of the pressure modulator. In the passenger compartment, disconnect the brake light switch at its connector located on the end of the master cylinder pushrod. Next, remove the master cylinder pushrod bolt and disconnect the pushrod from the brake pedal. The pushrod bolt nuts are not reusable and must be discarded. After disconnecting the pushrod, remove the 4 master cylinder mounting bracket stud nuts and set them aside for reinstallation. In the engine compartment, disconnect the reservoir vent hose and cut the reservoir vent hose nipple at the inner fender, leaving the remainder of the connector to plug the hole as shown here. The new reservoir cap will not have this vent hose. Now pull the brake hydraulic unit and mounting bracket forward until the bracket studs are clear of the dash panel. Tilt the inboard side of the unit up to gain access to the ECU harness connector and the supply line clamp. Disconnect the ECU harness from the pressure modulator at its connector. With the hydraulic unit in this same position, loosen the hose clamp and disconnect the supply line from the bottom of the reservoir and remove the hose from the clip on the accumulator block. Then lift the assembly up and out of the engine compartment. Place the hydraulic unit on a clean, dry workbench. When working on brake system components on the bench or on the vehicle, it's very important to keep the work area clean to avoid contamination of system components with dirt or foreign material. The next part of this service procedure involves the replacement of the low-pressure hose. To do this, first disconnect the low-pressure hose, large diameter pump supply hose, from the booster pump inlet as shown here. Next, cut the tie straps which hold the high and low pressure hoses together. The high pressure hose will remain in the vehicle. Now disconnect the wiring harness from the clips along the dash panel and pull the harness forward for access to the low pressure hose. Grasp the low pressure hose at the reservoir end and pull the hose through the outer mesh sleeve and remove the hose from the vehicle. Next, pull the large diameter mesh sleeve off the high pressure hose. Now make sure that all other wiring harnesses are clear from the dash panel behind the engine in order to gain clearance for installation of the new steel low-pressure tube. To do this, free all harnesses from their clips and pull them forward away from the dash panel. From the ABS service parts package, obtain the steel low-pressure tube assembly with the two foam sleeves attached. Route the end of the tube with the 90-degree bend behind the engine. Position the tube starting at the driver's side of the vehicle in the area where the master cylinder was removed. Work the tube behind the wiring harnesses and along the dash panel toward the passenger side of the vehicle. While performing this step, do not force or bend the tube. Be sure to leave the rubber caps on the tube to prevent contaminants from entering. When properly positioned, the pump end of the tube will be located between the vapor canister and the H valve. Next, obtain the S-shaped hose and two of the larger diameter hose clamps from the parts package, and slip one of the clamps over the straight end of the hose so that the clamp is oriented with the screw portion on the bottom as shown here. Also, for ease of assembly, the inside ends of the hose may be lubricated with brake fluid only. For this step and all other brake fluid applications during this service procedure, use only new Mopar brake fluid or an equivalent which meets SAE J1703 and DOT3 standards. After preparing the hose for assembly, remove the cap from the tube and install the straight end of the hose to the steel tube. Next, place the second clamp on the opposite end of the hose and slide the hose onto the nipple. Before tightening the hose clamps, adjust the position of the hose so that it's not contacting the shock stud or any other sharp surface. Now position the clamps on the hose and tighten the clamp screws to 10 inch-pounds or 1.1 Newton meters. The next part of this procedure involves the removal of the actuator piston assemblies from the hydraulic unit To do this, first secure the hydraulic unit in a vise. When doing this, be careful not to clamp on the modulator electrical connector located below the actuator. After securing the hydraulic unit, remove and discard the flange gasket from the hydraulic assembly mounting bracket or dash panel. Next, remove the brake light switch from the push rod by removing the bushings and sleeve from the rod end and sliding the switch off. Now separate the black dust boot from the actuator housing. Next, place a 1/2-inch box end wrench over the lower mounting stud of the hydraulic unit, and then install a nut onto the stud and turn it enough to engage the threads. Now push in on the wrench against the bearing, moving the bearing inward approximately 1/4 inch to relieve the bearing load from the snap ring. Insert a small screwdriver into the 12 o'clock keyway on the actuator and pry the snap ring down and out of the groove with the screwdriver. Pull the snap ring out of the end of the actuator and discard it. Next, slowly release the wrench from the bearing, allowing the primary piston assembly to pop out. Catch any fluid from the actuator bore in a suitable container. Now, carefully pull the piston out of the actuator bore, keeping the assembly as straight as possible. If the assembly catches in the bore, do not apply force. Realign the piston by pushing it back into the bore for a short distance and then try again to remove the piston. If the piston still will not come out of the actuator, then the actuator housing must be replaced. The actuator housing replacement will be demonstrated later in this videotape. If the piston can be freely removed from the actuator bore, continue the procedure by using a 12mm tube wrench to disconnect the secondary line from the front outboard port on the actuator. Gently pull the tube nut and line clear of the port, being careful not to bend the line. Next, remove the hydraulic unit from the vise and place the unit with the studs down on top of a lint-free cloth on the bench. Place another clean lint-free cloth over the 3 modulator outlet ports of the unit and hold the cloth in place while applying pressure from a regulated air nozzle to the secondary outlet port at the front of the actuator to expel the secondary piston assembly from the bore onto the cloth on the bench. Set the primary and secondary piston assemblies aside. They will not be reused. After removing the piston assemblies, place the hydraulic unit back into the vise and clamp it securely. The next part of this procedure involves the removal of the reservoir. To do this, loosen the hose clamp at the front of the modulator and disconnect the modulator return hose from the modulator. Next, using the back of the mounting bracket as a pivot point, lift and rock the reservoir with a flat blade screwdriver, pulling it free from the actuator and grommets. After freeing the reservoir, remove and discard the grommets from the actuator housing. Next, remove the bolt from the inboard face of the accumulator block, which secures the plastic-coated P-clip, and discard the clip. After discarding the clip, reinstall the bolt and tighten it to 11.5 foot-pounds or 15.6 Newton-meters. The next part of this procedure involves cleaning the actuator housing. To do this, first flush all 3 reservoir ports of the actuator housing with clean brake fluid. Allow the fluid to overflow and float out any contaminants. After flushing the ports, wipe them with a clean, lint-free cloth until all particles are removed. Next, squirt clean brake fluid into the secondary outlet port and allow the fluid to flush through the housing and flow out the open end. Use the supplied long-handled cleaning aid from the parts package to wipe down the interior of the housing. Wipe around the entire circumference of the bore and work any particles toward the open end of the actuator. After wiping down the bore, repeat the flushing procedure through the secondary outlet port. Next, insert a regulated air nozzle into the orifices in all 3 reservoir ports and blow air through the orifices to ensure that these passages are free of obstruction. Again, repeat the flushing procedure through the secondary outlet port as needed until the fluid exiting the housing is clear. The next part of this procedure involves the installation of new actuator piston assemblies. To do this, first lubricate the new primary and secondary piston assemblies with clean brake fluid. Wet the cup seals, white ring seals, and the O-rings. Next, install the secondary piston, spring end first, into the actuator bore. While installing the piston, be sure that the seal cup is not folded back or twisted. Push the secondary piston in until the rear end of the piston is flush with the actuator bore opening. Then position the caged spring located on the end of the primary piston assembly into the pocket in the rear of the secondary piston, and slowly push both piston assemblies into the bore, being careful not to cut, nick, or twist any of the seals. If a seal is damaged, the unit will not function properly. Also be careful not to let the caged spring slip out of the pocket in the secondary piston. Next, place the new supplied snap ring over the master cylinder push rod and bearing, and compress the piston into the bore with a wrench in the same manner that was used during removal of the snap ring. Be sure that the shoulder of the bearing is past the snap ring groove. With the keyway at the top of the bore as the 12 o'clock location, position the snap ring so that one end of the ring is in the 10 o'clock position and the other end of the ring is in the 8 o'clock position. The snap ring should cover the keyway at the 12 o'clock position. With the snap ring properly positioned, use a medium-size flat blade screwdriver to press the 10 o'clock end of the ring into the snap ring groove, and then work the rest of the snap ring into position in a clockwise direction. Make sure that the entire snap ring and both ends are seated completely in the groove. After seating the snap ring, slowly release the wrench and remove it from the mounting bracket. Now install the rubber dust boot over the actuator bore flange by seating the retaining ring of the boot into the groove. Install a new flange gasket from the parts package to the hydraulic unit mounting bracket. Next, reinstall the secondary line into the secondary outlet port. Tighten the fitting to 10 foot-pounds or 13.6 Newton-meters. Do not over-tighten the tube nut. Over-tightening may strip the threads. The next part of this service procedure involves replacing the boost pressure switch plug. For access to the plug, first disconnect the brake line from the rear inlet to the modulator. This is the line that comes from the rear brake fitting of the proportioning valve. Next, remove the steel plug and O-ring from the front end of the modulator switch housing. Now, lubricate the supplied O-ring and plug assembly from the parts package with clean brake fluid and install the assembly in the modulator switch housing. Tighten the plug to 13.5 foot-pounds or 18.6 Newton-meters. Next, reconnect the brake line and tighten it to 10 foot-pounds or 13.6 Newton-meters. The next part of this procedure involves the installation of the reservoir. To do this, first lubricate the supplied grommets from the parts package with clean brake fluid and install them in the actuator ports. Next, lubricate the reservoir nipples with clean brake fluid. Press the rear reservoir nipple into the port nearest the mounting bracket. Then press the primary and secondary nipples into the actuator grommets. The bottom of the reservoir must be flush with the grommets on all 3 ports. Inspect the complete circumference of each grommet. A pinched or buckled grommet or an excessive gap indicates that the reservoir is not properly seated into the actuator. Next, connect the modulator to reservoir return hose to the nipple on the modulator using a new clamp from the parts package. The next part of this videotape will demonstrate the proper procedure for replacing the actuator housing. The actuator housing must be replaced if you are unable to remove the pistons from the bore, as demonstrated earlier in this procedure. If actuator housing replacement is required, first disconnect the actuator to modulator boost line from the modulator. Disconnect the accumulator inlet line from the actuator. Disconnect the primary brake line from the actuator, and also disconnect the secondary brake line from the actuator. Next, remove the 2 modulator to mounting bracket attachment bolts, which are located on the bottom of the hydraulic unit. Now unclip the tubes from the front of the actuator. Remove the modulator and tube bundle by tilting the modulator forward and down, being careful to avoid excessive bending of the tubes. Next, remove the 2 actuator mounting nuts and remove the actuator from the mounting studs. Transfer the actuator to modulator boost line from the original actuator to the new supplied actuator and tighten the fitting to 10 foot-pounds or 13.6 Newton-meters. Also transfer the plastic tube clip to the front of the new actuator. Next, install the new actuator over the mounting studs and tighten the mounting nuts to 27 foot-pounds or 36.6 Newton-meters. Now reinstall the modulator and tube bundle to the assembly and clip the tubes to the front of the actuator. Avoid excessive bending of the tubes during reinstallation. Next, replace the 2 modulator to bracket attachment bolts and tighten them to 12 foot-pounds or 16.3 Newton-meters. Finally, reconnect the 4 lines which were disconnected earlier and tighten the fittings to 10 foot-pounds or 13.6 Newton-meters. Do not over-tighten the fittings. Over-tightening may strip the threads. The next part of this procedure involves the installation of the hydraulic unit. To do this, first reinstall the brake light switch to the end of the push rod. Next, place the hydraulic unit in the vehicle with the inboard side of the unit tilted up, as in removal. Connect the ECU harness to the connector on the modulator, being careful not to over-tighten the connector bolt. Now, position the hydraulic unit to the dash panel, being sure that the studs are seated in the dash panel holes. Next, lubricate the end of the supply hose with clean brake fluid. Install a new clamp on the hose and connect the hose to the end of the steel tube. Position the clamp with the screw on the opposite side of the hose from the fuel line and tighten the clamp to 10 inch-pounds or 1.1 Newton meters. In the passenger compartment, install the nuts on the 4 mounting bracket studs and tighten them to 31 foot-pounds or 42 Newton meters. Next, align the brake pedal, brake light switch, and master cylinder pushrod end and install the pushrod bolt. The bolt must be installed with the bolt head at the left side of the pedal to avoid interference with the dash panel bracket. Install new nuts from the parts package on the pushrod bolt. The inner lock nut should be tightened to 25 foot-pounds or 34 Newton meters, and the outer jam nut should be tightened to 75 inch-pounds or 8.5 Newton meters. Next, connect the brake light switch wire connector. In the engine compartment, reconnect the front and rear brake lines at the outboard side of the pressure modulator and tighten the tube nuts to 10 foot-pounds or 13.6 Newton meters. Next, reinstall the boost pressure switch and torque the switch to 100 inch-pounds or 11.3 Newton meters. Reconnect the wire connectors for the accumulator pressure, differential pressure, fluid level, and boost pressure switches. Next, remove the caps from the high pressure line and accumulator block elbow and attach the high pressure line to the elbow. Tighten the fitting to 62 inch-pounds or 7 Newton meters. The next part of this procedure involves securing the brake tube and hose. To do this, position one of the foam sleeves on the steel tube below the stud in the center of the dash panel behind the valve cover, and position the second foam sleeve below the stud on the passenger side of the vehicle. Wrap the 2 supplied rubber-coated P-clips from the parts package around the foam sleeves and secure the clips to the studs with the supplied push nuts as shown here. After securing the tube, reattach any wiring harnesses which were disconnected earlier for installation of the tube. Now, reroute the high-pressure brake hose into its initial position as necessary and tie wrap it into place. Finally, check along all brake tubes and hoses for any possible contact with sharp edges of surrounding components and reposition the tubes and hoses if required to eliminate any contact. The next part of this procedure involves bleeding the brake system. To do this, first fill the master cylinder reservoir to the V-shaped max fill mark with clean Mopar brake fluid or an equivalent with SAE J1703 and DOT 3 ratings. Next, reconnect the battery. Now turn the ignition switch to the on position to start the brake booster pump. The pump will take approximately 80 seconds to charge the system and will shut off when the system is fully charged. Be careful not to let the pump run dry while it's running. The pump can be severely damaged if it runs dry for any length of time, so be sure to keep an eye on the reservoir fluid level and add fluid as needed. Next, raise the vehicle on a hoist and inspect each front brake hose. If both front hoses are looped away from the tire and wheel during its entire turning travel, the routing is correct and no further hose service is required. However, if either front brake hose is looped toward the tire and wheel as shown here, replace the hose and ensure that the replacement is properly routed away from the tire and wheel. After ensuring that the front brake hoses are properly installed, thoroughly bleed the rear and front brakes following the applicable service manual procedures. After bleeding the system, thoroughly check the system for leaks at all the tube fittings, plugs, hoses, and bleed screws. The next part of this procedure involves the reinstallation of the window washer reservoir. To do this, connect the hoses and wires to the window washer reservoir and check for proper operation before installing the reservoir. The reason for doing this is because the front and rear circuits are interchangeable. After ensuring that the reservoir is properly connected, reinstall the reservoir to the inner fender panel and refill the reservoir with washer fluid. The final part of this procedure involves checking the system for proper operation and road testing the vehicle. To do this, first turn the ignition key on and make sure that the brake system indicator lights go off after the system self-test. This indicates normal system operation. Next, with the key still on, wait for 5 minutes without applying the brakes. The pump should not restart during this time. However, if one or both indicator lights stay on, use the DRB2 to identify any ABS system faults and correct them before road testing the vehicle. Also, before road testing, clear any fault codes that may be due to the replacement and bleed procedure. After ensuring that the system is operating properly and the fault codes have been cleared, the vehicle must be road tested. During road testing, make several normal stops and several stops during which the anti-lock brake system cycles and check for the proper pedal feel and brake operation. After road testing, check the system status again using the DRB2. Any stored faults must be corrected before returning the vehicle to the customer. Finally, after properly completing this service procedure, clear the fault codes from the vehicle memory. Dealers are urged to give their full support to this very important program by serving all involved owners promptly and courteously, and by carefully following the step-by-step service procedures detailed in this program. For further information regarding vehicle lists, owners of affected vehicles, service procedures, and claim reporting procedures, refer to the Dealer Safety Recall Notification Letter number 305T.